I was standing in the parking lot of Ravine Estate Winery, smoothing the front of my navy blazer and telling myself to stop overthinking everything, when Gerald grabbed my arm and pulled me behind the cedar hedge like I weighed nothing at all. I nearly dropped my purse. "Gerald? What on earth?" "Mrs. Evelyn." His voice was barely above a whisper, and his eyes had that look, the look I used to see in the hospital when a doctor needed to tell a family something they weren't ready to hear. Steady, deliberate, not panicked, but serious in a way that made the air feel thinner. "Please, don't let her see you. Come with me first. You need to hear something before you go in there." I stared at him. Gerald had worked the grounds at Ravine Estate for nearly 20 years. He had known my late husband, Robert. He had shaken Nathan's hand at every family dinner we'd ever held at this vineyard for the past decade. He was not a dramatic man. He was the kind of man who pruned rose bushes at 6 in the morning and held doors open for strangers without expecting a thank you. So I followed him. I didn't ask questions. I just followed him around the back of the stone building, past the barrel cellar, into the shadow of the old oak tree that stood against the limestone wall. And that's where everything I thought I knew about the next 5 hours of my life fell completely apart. I should start from the beginning, though. Because to understand what I witnessed that morning, you first have to understand what the last 4 years had looked like from where I was standing. Robert passed in the autumn 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which the doctors kept calling fast, as if speed made it somehow better or worse. We had been married for 37 years. We met at a church fundraiser in Kingston when I was 24, and he kept pretending to need help choosing between 2 nearly identical pies, just so he could keep talking to me. I married him 8 months later. He was the kind of person who made every room feel like there was more oxygen in it. After he was gone, our son Nathan was the one who kept me breathing. Nathan was 34. He worked as a civil engineer for a firm in Toronto that specialized in municipal infrastructure, bridges, water systems, the invisible bones of a city that nobody thinks about until something breaks. He had Robert's steadiness and my stubbornness, which meant he worked very hard and refused to complain about it. He came home to Kingston every few months, called every Sunday, and after Robert died, he called more often than that, sometimes just to tell me something small, a funny thing that happened on the subway, a restaurant he'd tried, a podcast he thought I'd like. I loved him more than I have words for. Vanessa came into his life about 2 years ago. He met her at a company event. She worked in marketing for a firm that had contracted with his company on a government infrastructure bid. She was 31, dark-haired, quick to laugh, and she looked at Nathan the way you hope someone will look at your child. I told myself that. I repeated it on a regular basis, like a thing I was trying to memorize for an exam. The truth was that from the very first dinner I had with both of them, a Sunday roast at my house in Kingston, late October, the kind of gray afternoon that makes the inside of the house feel especially warm, something in me would not settle. I couldn't name it. That was the frustrating part. It wasn't one thing she said. It wasn't anything she did wrong. She was perfectly pleasant. She helped clear the table without being asked. She said all the right things about Robert when Nathan showed her the photographs on the mantel. She laughed at my jokes. But there was a slight delay to everything, like watching a film where the audio is half a second behind the picture. You can't point to it, but your brain knows. I said nothing, because what was I going to say? I have a feeling, Nathan. A feeling I cannot explain or justify. But I'd like you to end a relationship with a woman who has done nothing wrong. So I watched. I paid attention. I filed things away. She never talked about her family. When I asked, she said she wasn't close to them, that her parents had split up when she was young and she'd grown up mostly alone. Fair enough. People have complicated families. I didn't push. She never talked about her life before Toronto. She'd mentioned once, very briefly, that she'd lived in Vancouver for a while before moving east. When I asked what brought her to Toronto, she said she'd needed a change. That was it. Needed a change. When Nathan called me in February to tell me he'd proposed and she'd said yes, I cried. Real tears. He thought they were happy tears, and part of me wanted them to be, so I let him believe that while I stood at my kitchen window watching the ice on the lake start to soften at the edges. The wedding was set for the second Saturday in June. Niagara on the Lake, at the Vineyard where we used to come every summer for Robert's birthday. Nathan had chosen it specifically because of that. He wanted his father present in some way, and I loved him so deeply for that I almost convinced myself everything was fine. Almost. The morning of the wedding, I drove down from Kingston alone. 3 hours on the 401, windows down once I hit the Niagara Peninsula because the air was thick with early summer and the kind of green that makes Ontario feel like the most beautiful place on earth. I had pressed my navy blazer. I had worn the pearl earrings Robert gave me on our 20th anniversary. I had told myself, the entire drive, that today was Nathan's day and whatever I felt didn't matter. I pulled into the parking lot at 10:45. The ceremony was at noon. I was early because I am always early, and because I couldn't sleep, and because the cottage I'd rented in town had a coffee maker that didn't work properly, and I'd given up on it at 8. That's when Gerald appeared. And that's when I found myself standing behind the old oak tree, not entirely sure my legs were working the way they were supposed to. "What did you need me to hear?" I asked him quietly. He held up his phone. His hand was steady, which told me he'd been carrying this for a while. "I heard her this morning. Early. Before the catering crew got in. I was checking the irrigation on the east garden, and she was on the far side of the arbor, on the phone. She didn't see me." He pressed play. The audio was slightly muffled. Outdoor recording, bird sounds in the background, the distant sound of a car on the road, but the voice was clear enough. I had heard that voice at my dining table. I had heard it say, "The food is wonderful. Evelyn and Robert sounds like he was an incredible man, and I can't wait to be part of your family." "You need to calm down," she was saying, on the recording, to someone I couldn't hear. "It's one day, one signature. That's all it is, and then we're done, and you get what you were promised. But if you call me again before tomorrow, I will." "Ryan, listen to me. I will make this much more complicated for both of us. You know what I'm holding. Do not test me today." There was a pause. "The girls are fine, they're with your mother. Now stop calling this number." Gerald stopped the recording. I stood very still. "The girls." I made myself breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way I used to tell patients to do when the news was bad and the room was spinning. "Ryan," I said, keeping my voice low, "do you know who she was talking to?" Gerald reached into the front pocket of his work shirt and unfolded a piece of paper, a printed screenshot. His granddaughter had helped him, he told me quietly, after he'd heard the call. He described what he remembered of what she'd said, and his granddaughter had helped him search. He handed me the paper. It was a Facebook profile, public. A man named Ryan Callahan, listed as living in Burnaby, British Columbia. In the profile photo, he was standing in front of a Christmas tree with 2 small girls, maybe 4 and 6 years old, both wearing matching pajamas with moose on them. And beside him, arm around his waist, smiling directly at the camera, was a woman I recognized. Her hair was longer in the photo, but the face was the same. Vanessa. Her name in the profile wasn't Vanessa. It was listed as Denise Callahan. Under the photo, someone, a relative maybe, an aunt, had commented, "Beautiful family, Ryan and Denise. Merry Christmas." The photo was from 18 months ago. 18 months ago, while Vanessa Denise was living in Toronto and attending company events and meeting my son, she had been photographed at Christmas with her husband and 2 daughters in Burnaby. I handed the paper back to Gerald. My hands were not shaking, which surprised me. I think I had already moved past the part where you shake and into the part where you simply act. "Did you show this to anyone else?" I asked. "No," he said. "I wanted to show you first." I nodded. I thought about Nathan. I thought about him at 16, learning to drive on the empty road behind our house, hands at 10 and 2, terrified of making a mistake. I thought about him at 22, calling me from his university dorm after a bad exam, and how quickly he recovered, how he always recovered. I thought about him standing at a Justice of the Peace at Rideau Hall at 28, trying to contain his grin. No, that wasn't right. That was a memory I didn't have yet, a future I'd hoped for. I thought about what a life built on a false foundation looks like when it finally collapses. And then I thought about 2 little girls in Burnaby in moose pajamas, whose mother was currently in a bridal suite 200 meters away, and whose father was apparently being managed like a liability. "I need to make a phone call," I said. "Give me 20 minutes. The first call was to Patricia, my closest friend from my nursing years, whose son-in-law happened to be a family lawyer in Street Catherines. I had his number because Patricia had given it to me after Robert died, in case I ever needed help with the estate. I had never used it. I used it now. His name was David, and he answered on the second ring, which I was grateful for. I told him what I knew. I kept my voice even. I gave him the facts, the recording, the photograph, the name Denise Callahan, the address in Burnaby, the husband, the children. He asked me 2 clarifying questions. Then he was quiet for a moment. "If what you're describing is accurate," he said carefully, "she's committing bigamy. That's a criminal offense under the Criminal Code of Canada. It doesn't matter that the previous marriage was in another province. Marriage is federal. It's valid everywhere." "What do I do right now?" I asked. I'd normally say gather more documentation first, but you have the recording, you have the photograph, and you have a ceremony starting, and he paused. "How long?" "Just over an hour." "I'm going to make a call," he said. "Don't go inside yet. Stay near the parking lot. Do you have someone with you?" I looked over at Gerald, who was standing quietly by the cedar hedge, with the expression of a man who had already decided he wasn't leaving until this was resolved. "Yes," I said. "I do." The next 40 minutes were the longest of my life. I sent Gerald inside on the pretense of checking the audio system. He had legitimate reason to be there, and I needed someone with eyes on the room. I stayed by my car. I called no one else. Not Nathan. Not any of the family members who were probably already seated, fanning themselves with the programs and commenting on the flowers. I thought about how to do this. I had been a nurse for 30 years. I had delivered news that changed lives in an instant, and I had learned that the cruelest version of that is doing it publicly, in front of an audience, in a way that robs the person of any dignity in the moment. I had always believed that. I believed it even now, even about Nathan, who deserved the truth more than he deserved a dramatic scene. But I also knew that if Vanessa Denise walked down that aisle and said those words and signed that marriage certificate, there was no clean way out of this for Nathan. An invalid marriage is one thing. A legally contested bigamous marriage, with a husband in Burnaby who clearly knew something was happening and was angry enough to call her this morning, is something far more complicated and far more painful. David called back at 11:40. "I spoke with a contact at Niagara Regional Police," he said. "They're sending someone. They want you to stay available. Don't initiate anything yourself. Can you do that?" "Yes, Evelyn." His voice was careful. "Your son is going to need you to be calm when this happens. Whatever you're feeling right now, set it somewhere you can find it later. He's going to need you." I had been a nurse. I knew how to set things somewhere for later. I had been doing it my whole adult life. "I know," I said. "Thank you, David." I sat in my car with the windows down and watched a pair of mourning doves on the stone fence at the edge of the property. They sat very close together without moving. Gerald came back to my car at 11:50. He bent slightly to speak through the window. "The groom's party is at the front. Nathan looks," he paused, "he looks happy." I nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak to that particular detail. "She's still in the suite," he said. "The bridesmaids went in about 20 minutes ago. The officiant is already in position." At 11:58, a dark sedan pulled into the parking lot. 2 officers stepped out, both in plain clothes but with the kind of posture that I recognized even without the uniform. One of them was a woman, early 40s, with dark hair pulled back and a manner that reminded me of the senior charge nurses I'd worked under, efficient and not unkind. She introduced herself as Detective Sergeant Whitmore from Niagara Regional Police. She shook my hand. "We received a call from David Arsenault," she said. "He forwarded us the audio file and the photograph. We've been in contact with our colleagues in BC. There is a marriage registration in British Columbia from 4 years ago, Ryan Patrick Callahan and Denise Marie Callahan, née Fortin. It has not been dissolved." I closed my eyes for 1 second, then I opened them. "Her name isn't Vanessa?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Vanessa appears to be her middle name. Her legal name is Denise Vanessa Fortin Callahan." Detective Whitmore's voice was professional and steady. "We're going to need to speak with her. We'd prefer to do this before the ceremony begins, if that's still possible." "What about my son?" I asked. "We can speak with him first, privately," she said. "Or..." She hesitated just slightly. "Would you prefer to speak with him yourself first? Sometimes it's better if it comes from family." I thought about that. I thought about what it would feel like to hear this from a stranger in plain clothes, in a parking lot, 1 minute before your own wedding. And I thought about what it would feel like to hear it from your mother. "Give me 5 minutes with him," I said. "Just 5. Detective Whitmore nodded. Her colleague stayed by the car. She and Gerald walked toward the side entrance together, and I walked toward the front of the building, where the guests were still filtering in through the main doors, where someone was playing something soft on a violin inside, where the summer air smelled like cut grass and fermenting grapes, and the particular sweetness of a day that doesn't know yet what it's about to become. I found Nathan in a small anteroom off the main hall. He was adjusting his cufflinks in front of a mirror silver cufflinks that had been Robert's, which he'd asked me for 2 months ago and which I'd driven to Toronto specifically to deliver. He was wearing a charcoal suit. His hair was the same stubborn wave Robert's had always been. He looked so much like the boy who'd stood at the end of the hospital corridor after his father's last procedure, trying very hard to hold himself together. He saw me in the mirror and smiled. "Mum, you look great. I was wondering where you—" He stopped. He turned around. He read my face the way children read their mother's faces, the way they learn to do before they have words for it. "What's wrong?" I crossed the room and took his hands in mine. I told him everything, quietly, directly, the way I had always believed news should be delivered without softening it into a lie and without being cruel with the truth. I told him about Gerald. I told him about the recording. I told him about the photograph. I told him about Denise Vanessa Fortin Callahan and the 2 daughters in Burnaby and the husband she'd apparently been threatening into silence. He didn't speak. He stood very still and listened, and the color slowly changed in his face, the way light changes in a room when the clouds come in gradually, and then all at once. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The girls," he said finally. "She has daughters." "2," I said. "Young. 4 and 6, from the photo." He nodded slowly, as if he were cataloging information and needed to place it correctly. "That was Nathan. That was always Nathan." Even at his worst moments, he sorted through things methodically before he let himself feel them. Robert had been the same way. "Mum," he said, "she was going to sign those documents today." "I know. She wanted to be added to the we talked about the RRSP beneficiary and the account at TD, and she said after the wedding she wanted to—" He stopped. He let out a long, slow breath through his nose. "She was very specific about all of it. Very specific." "I know," I said again. He squeezed my hands once, hard. Then he let go. He stood up straighter. "Okay," he said. "What do we do?" 2 minutes later, Detective Whitmore and her colleague entered through the side door. I stayed in the anteroom with Nathan, who sat on the small wooden bench that was probably meant for flower arrangements, and pressed his palms flat on his thighs and looked at the middle distance. We could hear the guests murmuring on the other side of the wall. Violin music still played, soft and completely unaware. Someone laughed at something. A child's voice asked a question. I sat beside my son and said nothing, because sometimes that is the only right thing to do. What happened next, I did not see directly. I learned it afterward, in pieces, from Gerald and from one of Nathan's cousins who had been seated near the back and had a clear view of the side entrance to the hall. Detective Whitmore had gone to the bridal suite. She had knocked. She had shown her identification to the bridesmaid who opened the door, and then she had asked, very calmly, to speak with Denise Fortin. There was a silence, by all accounts, and then the door had opened wider. I was told that she came out of the bridal suite still in her wedding dress, ivory with a long train that she had to gather in one hand as she walked. Her hair was already pinned, small white flowers threaded through it. Her makeup was done. She looked, by every external measure, exactly like what she was pretending to be. I was told that she tried, briefly, to argue, that she said the name Denise Fortin meant nothing to her, that there must be a mistake, that someone was trying to ruin her wedding day, that she wanted a lawyer. I was told that Detective Whitmore had produced a printed copy of the BC marriage registration and shown it to her without comment. And then there was no more arguing. Nathan's cousin said that what she remembered most was how quiet it was. That in a room full of people who had dressed in their best clothes and driven hours to witness a beginning, the only sound was the violin, which kept playing for almost 30 seconds after the officers walked through, because the musician couldn't see what was happening from where she sat and didn't know to stop. And then it did stop, and then everyone knew. I didn't go into the hall. I stayed with Nathan in the anteroom until we heard it all go quiet, and then I went to find him a glass of water and a few minutes alone, which is what he asked for, and which I gave him without comment or apology or the kind of hovering that helps the person doing the hovering more than the person in pain. When he came back out, his eyes were red at the corners, but his voice was steady. "I want to go home," he said. "Can we go to the cottage? Can we go to Prince Edward County?" "Yes," I said. "Of course." We drove together. He left his car at the winery. I drove, the same way he'd driven me home from the hospital 4 years ago, when Robert was gone, and I couldn't see the road through the dark and the grief. Now I drove and he sat in the passenger seat and watched the Niagara escarpment slip past the window and said nothing for a very long time. At some point, somewhere around Picton, he said, "How did you know? You always seemed like you weren't sure about her, but you never said anything." "I didn't have anything concrete," I said. "Just a feeling." "A feeling," he repeated. "Your grandmother called it a quiet alarm," I said. "She said some people have them and some people don't, and the ones who do should learn to trust them." He was quiet for a moment. "Did she say what you do when the alarm goes off and you can't do anything about it?" "She said you wait," I said. "She said you stay close and you wait for the moment when you can actually do something useful. And then you do it." We reached the cottage at dusk. The light on the lake was copper and long, the way it gets in late June in Ontario when the sun takes its time. I made tea because that is what I do in every crisis, large or small, because a kettle is the only thing in the world that always does what you expect it to do. Nathan sat on the dock for a long time after dinner, feet hanging over the edge, looking at the water. I watched him from the window, the way I used to watch him from the back steps when he was small and had gone quiet after something hard, giving him the space to come back on his own terms. He eventually came inside and stood in the kitchen doorway. "Those girls," he said, "in BC, the little ones." "I thought about them too," I said. "They didn't do anything wrong." "No," I said, "they didn't." He nodded slowly. "I hope someone's making sure they're all right." That was my son. That was the thing. Robert and I had somehow managed to raise a man whose first thought, even in the wreckage of his own pain, was for 2 little girls in Burnaby who didn't know their mother was in handcuffs in a Vineyard parking lot in Niagara-on-the-Lake, wearing a wedding dress that didn't belong to the name she'd given him. Denise Vanessa Fortin Callahan was charged with bigamy under the Criminal Code of Canada. She was also charged with fraud over $5,000, which David later explained was related to certain financial representations she had made to Nathan during their engagement. Ryan Callahan, her husband in Burnaby, had apparently known she had gone to Toronto but had not known about the marriage plan, or so he told investigators. Whether that was entirely true, I couldn't say. The girls were fine. They were with their grandmother. Nathan took 2 weeks off work. He spent most of them at the cottage. He went fishing twice. He called me every evening. He never once said I should have listened to you, which I was grateful for, because I had not done what I did to be right. I had done it because he was my son, and Robert was gone, and there was no one else on earth who loved Nathan the way the 2 of us had, and now that duty fell to me alone. I was not going to let him walk into a life that was built on nothing. The morning after it all happened, I went back to the Vineyard to retrieve Nathan's car. Gerald was already there when I arrived, trimming the edge of the rose garden along the front path, the same way he'd been trimming it for 20 years. He looked up when I walked over. "How is he?" he asked. "He's going to be all right," I said. "How did you know to find me?" "In the parking lot, that morning. You didn't know what time I was arriving." He smiled a little, the way people smile when they've been carrying something for a while and it's finally lighter. I didn't. I'd been watching for a car I recognized since 7 that morning. I walked that lot 3 times. When I saw your Civic, I stood by the entrance and waited. I looked at him, this man who had known my husband, who had worked this land for 20 years, who had walked a parking lot 3 times at 7 in the morning because he had heard something he couldn't unhear and had decided, quietly and without fanfare, that he was not going to let it pass. "Thank you, Gerald," I said. He nodded. He went back to his pruning. I drove Nathan's car back along the Niagara Parkway with the windows down and the lake on my left, and I thought about what it means to pay attention. Not the dramatic, effortful kind of attention, not the kind that announces itself or demands credit. The quiet kind. The kind that notices the half-second delay in someone's smile. The kind that keeps watch from the kitchen window while someone you love sits alone on a dock at dusk. The kind that walks a parking lot 3 times if that's what it takes. Robert used to say that love is mostly just sustained attention, that you could measure how much someone loved you by how carefully they watched over you, not to control, not to smother, but in the way a lighthouse keeps watch, steadily, without rest, without needing to be thanked. I think he was right. I think he was almost always right. And if you are listening to this, whether you are a mother, a father, a sister, a brother, a friend to someone who is standing at the edge of a decision that doesn't feel right, trust that quiet alarm. Don't dismiss it because you can't prove it. Don't silence it because you're afraid of being wrong or being called overprotective or being told you're making something out of nothing. Pay attention, stay close, and wait for the moment when you can actually do something useful. Then do it.